Cultural studies. Cultural studies is focused on the growth of particular identities and the ways in which we shape our understanding of the world around us in our everyday lives. How is this important for literary studies? From a cultural studies perspective, texts are one aspect of a complex set of cultural influences. Literature, in this respect, is an important contributor to the meanings we make in everyday life. Literature is a dynamic force that is simultaneously shaping and being shaped by the culture in which it is consumed. Stuart Hall introduced the idea of decoding to explain the process by which the meanings and messages of a text are received and made sense by an audience. While the message is encoded by its creator with a set of meanings, the ways in which these are unraveled by the receiver are not fixed, but change depending on social context, cultural understanding, and past experiences. Within this, there is a possibility for radical and political positions to be taken. Hall suggests that the interpreter can take three positions: dominant hegemonic position, negotiated position, and oppositional position. In dominant hegemonic position, the meaning is taken just as it was encoded. When these meanings are reproduced, they advance the ideas of their producers, elite producers, and thereby fueling the dominance of existing groups and supporting hegemony. In negotiated position, the interpreter accepts but also modifies the dominant meaning. This makes it possible for the interpreter to recognize their own needs within the context of appearing to conform. In oppositional position, the interpreter recognizes the suggested meaning but intentionally decides to impose an alternative meaning. This leads to the possibility of changing dominant ideas. Central to the cultural studies position are questions about agency, the extent to which individuals can act according to their own free will, and to what extent they are shaped by the cultural forms to which they are exposed. It is easy to think that we are not shaped by what we read or view, and to see those we disagree with as negatively influenced by culture. In other words, indoctrinated. In reality, cultural forces shape us all. Frankfurt School theorists attribute more role for resistance and change in how we relate to cultural influences. In this new context, the consumption of mass culture does not entirely remove the agency of the individual. We might be influenced by mass culture into serving the desires of political power, but we can also find possibilities of radical counter-arguments. What must be studied is not simply a text in isolation, but how it functions in a particular moment, in use by a particular individual or community. In this sense, the mass cultural text becomes much more ambiguous. Barthes presents events as examples of modern myths. Prefiguring much work in cultural studies today, he suggests that such myths are significant for their cultural power. Myths encourage us to accept ideas and events while forgetting their political character. Myths, in this sense, naturalize events and serve the ruling power. They are essential to the idea of hegemony, part of the way in which ruling powers use culture to discourage revolt and encourage acceptance of preferred ideologies. Two particular terms that come from Barthes' cultural studies work with relevance to literary studies are the terms denotation and connotation. Working from Saussure's idea of the sign, Barthes examines how meaning is more complicated than the ahistorical, stable idea of the relationship between signifier and signified. Barthes considers these meanings in relation not merely to words but to objects and images. The denotation of a sign is stable. It is the same as Saussure suggests about the signified. The idea of connotation has been important to cultural studies because it stresses the ways in which meanings come about as part of culture. Meanings are ideological and shaped by the world in which they are consumed. Connotations are fluid, changing, and can only be considered in the context of their production and consumption. One consequence of so many different influences is that cultural studies become naturally interdisciplinary. To make sense of a text means to consider it in relation to other texts that will have shaped how audiences decide upon its connotations. There is increasing discussion in academic terms of interdisciplinary work, but also to related terms such as transdisciplinarity, infusion, and intersectionality. While interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity suggest crossing disciplinary boundaries, it is only in the latter that disciplines dissolve. Intersectionality is a politicized version of interdisciplinarity, which stems from feminism and in which one recognizes the need to acknowledge multiple sources of marginality and oppression when discussing questions of identity. Critical race studies examine how ideas of race and particularly racial prejudice are maintained over time, particularly with regard to racist practices. It is also interested in how such ideas might be challenged through cultural practice. In the arts and humanities, the legal foundations of critical race theory are frequently fused with ideas coming from philosophy. One particular consequence of the focus in cultural studies on organic grassroots forms is an interest in subcultures, underground or oppositional cultures that distinguish themselves from the mainstream. Unlike countercultures, subcultures exist not specifically to be oppositional, but rather to define themselves uniquely. The ways in which these subcultures are shaped through music, clothes, and social practices illustrate the cultural construction of identities through multiple influences. All these have relevance for literary studies. It broadens the range of cultural objects we see as texts and puts literature in a larger context. It asks questions about what constitutes value with consequences more specifically for debates in literature. Questions surrounding the value of studying popular cultural forms call into question literary ideas of canonicity that have also been destabilized by critiques from gender and post-colonial studies and genre theory.